Well, good evening. It's good to be back this evening. I appreciate Austin this morning. I've heard a lot of good things from Austin, and I never doubted that he would not do a great job. And so while the family and I were away at Southside this morning, I'm grateful to be back tonight. The kids were running along playing there, and Macy Kate ended up in the bathroom, and I won't give you any more than that. So that's why they're not with me tonight, but they were down there with me this morning, so we were grateful to be with the congregation down there and a good group of Christian folks down there. If you have your Bibles this evening, we're going to Matthew 21. Matthew 21. I mentioned last week that there are several things that just kind of appear to be out of order sometimes, and because they appear to be out of order, a lot of the Bible critics have taken that to be contradictions. And one of those, perhaps most questioned, I guess, in terms of timing of things, is the cleansing of the temple. I was after last Sunday evening, we talked about the temptations of Jesus and the fig tree and how, different order, different things, and trying to piece all that together and harmonize all that. And after church, Austin comes up and he says, "Have you ever done much with the temple cleansing?" And I said, "Well, no, not a whole lot." And he said, "Well, and he was asking me some questions about it. And then when I got back to my preaching schedule, I thought, well, Austin, if you just hang on a few days, I'll deal with that a little bit. I didn't even know that was coming up. But then he's not here tonight, so I guess I'll have to bug his ear this week sometime or something. But anyway, the big question is, are there two temple cleansings? Or is there just one? And if there is just one, then John, in the passage that Micah's already read, John's account, but let's look at Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's account. In Matthew chapter 21, you know what happens in the first 11 verses? Jesus comes into Jerusalem. So we're in the last week of his life on earth. We're toward the end. I mean, we're getting ready for the cross. And we're getting ready for the resurrection and all that. We're in the last few days of Jesus' life here on this earth, at least in the body form, before the cross. And verse 12 says he goes into the temple and he drives out those who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of robbers." Now those verses are not new to you. You're just reminded of when Jesus gets into Jerusalem. He goes into the temple very quickly here in Matthew 21. And when he gets in there, he sees these money changers and he mentions pigeons, those sellers of pigeons. And he goes in and he overturns the tables, and then he quotes Isaiah 56 in verse 7, where my house is to be a house of prayer, but you've made it into a den of robbers. Now come over to Mark's account. We did this last Sunday evening. You kept up pretty good, so I'm depending on you to do it again tonight. Mark chapter 11. Same exact thing happening here. The first 11 verses of Mark chapter 11. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Again, the last week of his life here on this earth. Of course, we have the fig tree. And you'll remember last week I mentioned that in the middle of this whole fig tree thing, in Mark's account, Mark 11, beginning in verse 12, and then you have to jump down to verse 20 to get the end of that whole story that we studied last week. But in the middle of this, verses 15 through 19, they come to Jerusalem, verse 15. He goes into the temple and he begins to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. He overturned the table of the money changers and the seat of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Now there's a little added detail to this whole thing. And he was teaching them, saying, is it not written? And then he quotes Isaiah 56 and verse 7 again. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And then they began to seek to try to destroy him. So pretty much the same story. It falls right in line with the same timing. Right after having come into Jerusalem, Mark puts this little fig tree part of the story in there right in the beginning of that. And then they go into the temple and he turns over the tables of those who sold pigeons, and he won't let anyone pass through the temple. Now that was one unique detail to Mark's account. But now come over to Luke 19. Same thing, different writer, but same time. You get over to Luke 19, and you have Zacchaeus wanting to see Jesus. So we know he's coming, right? Zacchaeus gets to see him. They go to his house, and then following that, Jesus ends up into Jerusalem. Just as Matthew 21 and Mark 11 started, you get down to about verse 28 of Luke 19, and you have this entry into Jerusalem. You get down to about verse 41, and Jesus looks over Jerusalem, and he's saddened by what he sees. He's saddened by the spirituality of the people. And then you come down to verse 45. And he enters the temple, and he begins to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Again, for the third time, we have Jesus quoting from Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 7. So Matthew 21 and Luke's account is just real short, real concise. He goes in, and he begins to drive out those who sold. Luke don't even tell us that he turned any tables over. Luke don't tell us that he wouldn't allow anybody to pass through. It just tells us that he goes in and he starts to drive them out. Luke don't even tell us what they were selling. But obviously we have the same occasion here. It follows the entry into Jerusalem, just almost flowing right in with maybe a little detail here or there that's a little different. But it appears to me that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all write about this time when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and fairly quickly, having surveyed Jerusalem, he goes down to the temple, and they are making a marketplace of the temple. They're buying and selling and trading. If you study and read some secular sources, you'll learn that they had the proper animals for sacrifices, and so they had come up with this plan that in order to make life easier for the Jews, they would just have the animals there at the temple ready for the sacrifices, and they would do like people do in a Coke machine, right? You know, if you really want this Coke bad enough, you're going to pay for the convenience of it, okay? So we're going to double the price, you know, where normally you'd pay $1.50 for a Coke. You liable to pay $2.50 or $3 for a Coke in a machine. But there it is, on the spot, and you get it, right? It was kind of a similar deal. They said, well, hey, we're going to have these animals down here ready, and people traveling long distance. Oh, don't worry about bringing the animals. We'll just up the price a little bit, charge you a convenience fee, and we'll make a lot of money on this deal. And it had become a money-making process as a result of them needing these animals for sacrifices. They were supposed to bring them with them to offer them on the altar at the temple. But because maybe they didn't have, or because maybe they didn't want to bring, now there are people that are making a huge profit. And that's what Jesus comes into. And it's in the temple court there. And he's upset about it. Well, when you turn over to John chapter 2, and I won't reread what Mike has already read, but now let's just stop for a moment before we think about some things that John mentions. And let's think about the timing of all this, because in John chapter 2, in the first 12 verses, Jesus is at the wedding feast in Canaan. That is the first miracle. His first earthly miracle. And then right after that is his interaction with Nicodemus at night. Now, what's ironic to me is that the first 5 chapters of the book of John, The first 5 chapters of the book of John are not recorded anywhere in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Now, by me saying that, I'm telling you what I believe about this temple cleansing, right? Because here's the deal. Either you got one temple cleansing, and John chose to put it way, way, way early, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke chose to put it in the last week of his life. Now, very quickly this preacher will remind you that everything in this book is not arranged chronologically. I said that last week. I still believe that. It's a fact. Whether I believe it or not, it's a fact. That everything in this book is not arranged chronologically. And perhaps more than anybody, the Apostle John wrote less chronologically than anybody else. I mean, this guy, he is brilliant. I mean, he is writing by the Spirit, as all of them were, but John is just, I mean, his gospel account is different altogether. If you've done any study, you know what I mean. The material is just different. The subject matters are different. The arrangement's different. I mean, it's just a whole different gospel account. And so we can stand here tonight and we can say that John arranged his gospel account topically, and I'm okay with that. And so therefore he didn't care that Jesus actually cleansed the temple over there in the last week of his life. He wanted to tell us about it up here after the first miracle. Well, if that's what you want to believe, that's fine. I would quickly say to you, do you have any evidence to prove that there can only be one temple cleansing? And you'd have to say, no, I don't have any evidence. Show me some evidence to prove that there was only one and that there could only be one. And you can't show me any. There is no evidence. So here's my conclusion to this. And let me say that drawing a hard, fast conclusion is probably impossible. Okay? But if you allow Jesus to cleanse the temple twice, then you come here in John chapter 2, very early in His ministry, and you admit that John 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are nowhere in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those 5 chapters, they just didn't record any of that material. So we don't have any repeating or parallel passages, if you will. We get into John chapter 6 and we have the feeding of the 5,000, which is one of those miracles, the only miracle that appears in all four gospel accounts. So John tells us about a cleansing of the temple that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. And then you go, well, why wouldn't they tell us about it? Well, perhaps it's because they're going to tell us about one later. And they're going to emphasize the one at the end of his life. But John wants us to know about, because look back in John chapter 2. Now look at what all is going on here. Obviously, verse 13, the Passover of the Jews is at hand. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. Okay? So this is, remember that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, He's in Jerusalem. Why? To be crucified. He goes to Jerusalem to be crucified. But remember, as a Jew, they would go to Jerusalem on the Passover every year. And we know that Jesus lived at least through 3 and probably 4 Passovers. You'd have to give me a little to get that 4th one in there. We can get 3 in there for sure. And possibly 4 Passovers in his adult ministry, in his adult life. And so thus why we would conclude that He died around 33, 34 years old, because of those Passovers, one annually. And so here in John's account, I would suggest to you, it's not Him going to Jerusalem to be crucified. It's Him going to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. Because He lived under the Old Testament and He abided by the Old Testament laws, among which was the observance of the Passover. Now obviously at the time of the Passover, there's going to be a lot of people in Jerusalem, going to be a lot of sacrificing going on, going to be a lot of time for business. You ever been to a sporting event? You notice all the ticket sellers out on the side of the road? I mean, men are everywhere. Those people are called business of opportunity. That's what they're called. You know, here's my opportunity. You go down. You go to to a baseball field on a day when they ain't got a game, and those people ain't there, right? And it shouldn't be very shocking to you. They run a business of opportunity. Well, this particular business in the temple was a business of opportunity. Here's their opportunity. It's the Passover. Man, we got a crowd of people here. And they need these animals, right? So obviously we've got a reason to be there and a reason to sell. And obviously the selling and the marketing business is going very great. And when Jesus sees this, and John goes on and tells us that there was oxen and there was sheep. Not just pigeons, but oxen and sheep. John tells us in verse 15 that Jesus makes him a whip of sorts in order to drive them out with. And not only does he drive the people out, but he drives the animals out as well. This is all new information. Now, you got a choice to make. Either John is giving us additional information about the one temple cleansing, or John's giving us information about a whole different cleansing altogether. And there's two of them. This is not additional information. This is just him telling us about the cleansing that only he tells us about. And so therefore we're not trying to parallel it with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, although there are many similarities. And he drives them out. And he pours out the coins of the money. Well, nobody's told us that yet, that he poured out their bags of money. So that's a new piece of information. He overturns their tables. What I'm saying is there's about 5 things in John's account that does not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so you get into this business of, well, who wrote first and who wrote second, who borrowed from who, and who used who as a source, and all of that is people doing that's smarter than I am. Bottom line is that somebody wrote first out of the 4. You recognize that, right? And it's very possible that whoever didn't write first had whoever did write first gospel account. Hello? Right? So it's very possible that Matthew could have been reading Mark and said, oh yeah, let me tell the Jews about this. Mark's done told the Gentiles about it, but I need to tell the Jews about Jesus doing this too. So thank you, Mark, for reminding me, it was in letter form, of this particular occurrence. And then Matthew might go on and add a detail or two that he has. And so what scholars are trying to do is to harmonize and unify all this together. And what you need to keep in mind is that additions don't necessarily require sources, nor does it imply a later time. Because what they'll say is, well, John wrote last. And John felt like he needed to tell us more than anybody else. You know that whole deal where you sit around in a circle and you tell something in somebody's ear and they whisper it to the next person and to the next person to the next person. Go all the way around the room, see what you got coming back, you know. It's funny how some people feel like they just need to add something to it, right? Now some people don't hear it correctly and they misrepeat it, okay? But then there are other people who think they hear things they don't hear because nobody lies, right? And they just add a little bit to it. Well, that happens sometimes in writing too. You know, you read something and you go, hey, but you know, if we just put this in here, it would make it. I mean, man, Jesus got him a whip. And he started driving him out with a whip. Boy, wouldn't that make it Hollywood style? You know? And so those that are trying to harmonize all of this would say, well, John just chose to give us some additional information. Well, I'm not sure about all of that. And the only argument against the fact that there's not 2 temple cleansings, the only argument that I can find is that all of these occasions are so similar. That's the only one I can find. Well, yeah, they're similar. Guess what? He was in the same place. There can only be people making a den of robbers out of the house of prayer called the temple in one place. It can't happen on the street corner. It's got to happen in the temple. So it don't matter if it happens 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 33 times. It's got to happen in the same place. John tells us it's at the Passover. We know that there was a Passover occurring during the last week of Jesus' life. So they say, well, we got the same time. Well, again, this is a business of opportunity. When is the opportunity? Well, every time there's a major league ball game, there's all those ticket scalpers standing on the corner. Every time the Predators play in Nashville, there's ticket scalpers standing out there on the street corners. It's not just one game. It's not just two games. It's every home game for the entire season. So they go every Passover for the entirety of every year. They know it's coming. They show up for it. They save their animals for it. They raise more animals for it. So, yeah, there's some similarities here. Jesus goes in and He gets upset and he overturns the tables. That's exactly right. If He'd gone in there and found it a half a dozen times, He'd done the same thing a half a dozen times. You say, well, it's the same problem. Well, yeah, it's the same problem. Do reoccurring problems ever happen in the church? Do churches ever battle a particular problem and then 3, 4, 5, 10 years later we got the same problem? Of course it happens. And so who's to say? Now, if you follow the timing, John chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 21 are about 3 years apart. Maybe 4 at the most, but at least 3 years apart. So could it be that Jesus went in and cleansed the temple? 3 years later they've come back in and started their business again. Well, I've seen cops run off ticket scalpers before, and I've turned up 5 minutes later and I see them on the other corner down there. Folks, evil people ain't gonna run them away that easy. Just going in there one time and overturning those tables ain't going to stop them forever from coming back and doing it again. Well, you'd be crazy to think it would. So could Jesus have had to have done it more than once? Well, it's certainly possible. But again, with certainty, I can't make a conclusion here. But here's what I know. There's a message in all of this, isn't there? And you better get the message. Jesus says in John 2, do not, verse 16, make my Father's house a house of trade. Ironically enough, John doesn't even quote Isaiah 56 and verse 7. And the other three did. So it appears to me that if Jesus had quoted Isaiah 56 and verse 7, and I believe He did in the second cleansing, I just feel like John would have quoted it here in John 2. Maybe Jesus didn't quote Isaiah 56 and verse 7 in the first cleansing. But what He did say there in verse 16, do not make my Father's house a house of trade. What He had said back in Matthew, Mark, and Luke was, from Isaiah 56, this is supposed to be a house of prayer and you've made it into a den of robbers. And so here's the message for tonight. Here's the thought I want you to take home with you. Here's what I want you to chew on. In what ways are we robbing God? In what ways have we made the house of God in such a way that we are robbing it? We don't have the temple in Jerusalem anymore, right? Jesus told the woman at the well in John 4, neither on that mountain nor in Jerusalem. But true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. For that is what God is, and that is what He is seeking. And so now we believe firmly that the Leoma Church of Christ, this is our temple, if you will. This is God's temple. This is where we worship. This is our mountain. Provided we do it in spirit and in truth, we are pleasing to God. You go down the road and you find another family of the Lord's, and that's God's temple there. And provided they do it in spirit and in truth, they are worshiping God in the manner that God has prescribed, just as we are. So if we're going to talk about the house of God, this is the house of God. Now, a couple of things. Number one, we're missing a huge group at Long Branch, right? I hope they're doing well and everything's safe. And the other thing is that I happen to clean this place up about weekly. So So I don't want you to think this comes from any ill will or ill intentions. But folks, I want to encourage you. I want to remind you. This place is a special place. And we need to treat it like that. You know, as hot as I was, I preached 3 times this morning without air conditioning. So the last thing I want to do when I got home was put my tie back on, okay? And I'll be honest with you. I preached last Sunday night without my coat on, you know. And as I got ready to come tonight, I thought, you know, Rodney, you really need to be in a coat and a tie tonight because of the topic that you're on. But then I got thinking, you know, that's not really what this is about. If you don't wear a coat to every service, that's fine. Or a tie to every service, that's fine if you're a man. Or if you don't wear a dress to every service if you're a lady, that's not what this is about. This is about understanding that we're in a holy place. We're in a special place. We need to take care of this place. You know, if you want to trash your home, you trash your home. And if you think I've quit preaching and gone to meddling, you just come down here about Thursday afternoon and pick this place up with me. I mean, this is important, okay? We are showing our honor and our respect for God. And when you and I haphazardly, lazily, carelessly treat God the way we treat other things in life, what have we done? What are we doing? What are we saying by our actions? When we destroy and do things that would tear up and break, or when we do things that we've been asked not to do, or when we don't properly care for things in the Lord's house the way we ought to care for them. What are we saying to God? I see, what I'm asking you to do tonight is consider, is there areas in my life where I am robbing God? You know, hey, I know where I'm at. As tired as I am, I know where I'm at. I'm on Sunday night. I know where I'm at. You folks come. Y'all come. You realize that there's a lot of people that are robbing God because they won't even come. Right? They're robbing God. They're robbing themselves because they won't even make it a priority to come on Sunday night. That's not you. I realize that. I'm not talking to you. I'm just admitting to you that when we don't take advantage of every opportunity to worship God, sometimes we can't. And sometimes life don't allow us that opportunity. And sometimes health don't provide for us. But when we willingly neglect an opportunity, we're robbing God. And we're robbing ourselves of a blessing. But then there are other ways that those of us who are here tonight, there are other ways that we can rob God. Like when we show up and it's not in spirit. You know, I love the attitude. Do we have to go to church tonight? You know, I love it. And I really don't. You understand? That's sarcasm. And then when we come, and I've been there, and I've done it, you know. Hey, let me tell you what's harder than having services after lunch on Sunday? Having services in a building without air conditioning. Try that one, right? We come and we've busted it, you know, doing our own thing. I stayed outside all day long yesterday. You know how hot it was yesterday? I was a miserable wreck last night. My body still ain't quit cramping. But we busted doing what we want to do, and then we come give God half of what we got left. Are we robbing God? Are we robbing ourselves? Have we made the house of God a den of robbers? No, this ain't a marketplace. We're not buying and selling. No, we're not exchanging animals. We're not looking for sacrifices. I'm not waiting on Jesus to come in and say, you know, quit making this a marketplace and turning the tables over. We're not making this a marketplace. That's not what this is about. But how can we apply it to our lives? Are we giving God less than our best? And if we are, then we're robbing God. And we're robbing ourselves of God's blessing. And so I just felt like at the end of this lesson, this was my opportunity to remind Rodney. Hey, Rodney, when you get up, you need to give God your best. If it's on Sunday, give God your best. If it's on Monday, you give God your best. And don't turn what God has allowed you to have a life of service into a den of robbers, into a den of robbery, where I am robbing God. Can a man rob God? You remember Malachi 3? Can a man rob God? Is God pleased when a man robs Him? Absolutely not. So I don't want you to be guilty. I don't want you to be guilty of robbing God. No, give God your best. Give Him your all. And I realize that this place is brick and mortar. Trust me, I realize that. But recognize it as a special place. Everybody driving up and down that road recognizes it as a special place. We need to give God our best. We come into this place, we give God our best. When we leave out of this place, we go out giving God our best. Don't take the life that God has given you and use it to rob Him, but rather use it to be faithful. What is required of a steward? 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2, that he be found faithful. Why? So that in Matthew 25, when we stand before the Master like the 5-talent and 2-talent man did, we can hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Don't rob God. If you're robbing God, then be prepared on Judgment Day for Jesus to come in and overturn the table of your life. Be prepared for Jesus to come in and take the money back and shake it out. Be prepared for Jesus with a whip in His hand to drive you out of the throne room of God as God is saying, "Depart from me, I never knew you. For you have robbed God." Don't be guilty of robbing God. And so tonight, as we sing the invitation song, analyze your life. Make sure you're giving God your best. And if you're not, we're here to help you in any way we can as we stand and sing.